The Saudis have definitely realized that the center of geoeconomic gravity in the world has shifted away from North America and Europe toward Asia. And they've been very pragmatic in terms of responding to these changes and adjusting their foreign policy in a much more multipolar world where China has a lot more influence than it did 20 or 30 years ago when it comes to sale of energy resources, investment, commercial ties. Saudi Arabia sees itself integrating into Asia. And there's no doubt that out of all the Asian countries, China is the most important piece of the puzzle. It's really difficult for us to exaggerate the extent to which Saudi Arabia values its relationship with China.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The Arab Gulf states, longtime allies, some might even say client states of the U.S., have been reliable partners of imperialism since their inception. But the world is changing fast. As Lenin put it, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. The last few months are a testament to that. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are ruled by a handful of families who were appointed by the British Empire and then sustained by the American Empire. Yet that hasn't stopped them from deepening their ties with America's foes, Russia and China, leading to tectonic shifts across the Middle East that have many DC insiders losing sleep. Saudi Arabia normalized not with Israel in negotiations overseen by the US, as many analysts expected, but rather made peace with Iran in talks that were facilitated by the Chinese. And there was a domino effect across the region. Saudi Arabia went on to move towards peace with Yemen, pushed for reintegration of Syria into the Arab League after spending a decade collaborating with the US to destroy it, all while deepening economic ties with China, even suggesting a future of selling oil to Beijing in Chinese currency, all while the US desperately tries to force the global south into Cold War 2.0. Saudi Arabia has also refused to get on board with sanctions on Russia or to give in to US demands to increase oil production. The same can be said of other Gulf states, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait. What's the reason for all these shifts across the Gulf? What's the thinking? Will they continue to oppose the new Cold War? Or are they too wedded to the US to actually forge a path independent of its interests? How much wiggle room does multipolarity afford them? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Giorgio Cafiero, the CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a Washington, D.C.-based geopolitical risk consultancy. But before we jump into it, this is just the first half of this episode. The second half is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Giorgio, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
It's great to have you on, and I'm so excited to discuss this topic of the Gulf states, and I think you're probably the best person to speak to. I mean, you've been writing a wonderful number of articles, like literally one of the only people doing it, kind of breaking down what's going on between almost every Gulf state and their relationship with either China or Russia. So you've been very busy the last few months because a lot has been changing. So let's just jump right into it. And I think, of course, like the best place to start would be Saudi Arabia, because it's sort of, I don't know if you'd agree on this, but kind of like the leader of the Gulf in many ways. And it's been doing the most at the moment. So Saudi Arabia, leader of the GCC, the biggest story was that Saudi Arabia made peace with Iran, which was a very big deal considering the last, almost decade of proxy wars and confrontations between these two countries in various places. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia reintegrating Syria into the Arab League. That was kind of a domino effect, I think, of Iran and Saudi Arabia making peace. And of course, the biggest deal about that also was that it was overseen by China. And also Russia played a role in the case of Syria. So let's start with China and Saudi Arabia. Everyone expected Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel. I certainly did. And in talks that were supposed to be overseen by the US. And instead, we saw them normalize with Iran. Like I mentioned, it happened in Beijing ultimately. And you've written about how Oman also played a role with that. In that, Iraq also played a role. So what is the significance of the role of China here? And I guess also the absence of the US in that deal?
Well, I think there are some vacuums in the Middle East, and this is occurring at a time in which US hegemony is in decline. And I think China has definitely taken advantage of some opportunities to become more of an assertive and influential diplomatic actor in the Middle East. In past years, China was very much focused, of course, on its economic interests in the region. But I think in Beijing, there's a realization that there is a real connection between advancing China's economic interests and China also helping to bring more stability to the Middle East and help countries in the region move past their wars, their disputes, and their conflicts. I think it's really important to see the Chinese diplomacy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and Iran within the context of Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese understand that conflicts in the Middle East, and so many conflicts have been tied to the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that all threatens China's economic interests in the Middle East. And what the Chinese really want is stability. It's very significant that China, instead of any Western country such as the US, played an important role in bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran toward this renormalization agreement. China has a certain pillar to its foreign policy in the Gulf, which is just the same as Russia's. It's got three prongs: enemies of no one, allies of no one, and friends with everyone. So China is close to Iran, close to Iraq, and close to all six of the GCC states. This positioned China to be seen as a trustworthy actor, both from the perspective of Tehran as well as Riyadh. Given the hostility between the US and Iran ever since 1979, the idea of Washington being trusted by the Iranian officials is completely out of the question. And then obviously, as a consequence of the conflict in Ukraine and the role that Iran has played in that conflict, relations have deteriorated between Iran and European countries. So China, as I said, was really able to play this role, and it really speaks volumes about the extent to which the world is becoming much less West-centric and much more multipolar.
And that's also important, I think, to mention. And you could even probably make the argument that, I don't know if it's ever going to happen anytime soon, but China would also be, contrary to how the West views China in respect to the conflict with Ukraine and Russia, it actually has a really good trade relationship with Ukraine. I think it's one of Ukraine's biggest trading partners. So in a way, you could even say that at some point in the future, China could be well positioned to negotiate something between those two countries. It's actually not arming either side, other than just being a close ally of Russia. But, I also think, I'm curious if you could talk a bit here about the Saudi view on China, right? They're clearly not on board with this U.S. Cold War escalation with China. We've seen that in many cases, Saudi Arabia, like, for example, with the Uyghurs, Saudi Arabia refused to play into the U.S. narrative on that and stood by China, even though it's like this Muslim issue, right? It's refusing to participate in sanctions. It's embracing, a greater trading relationship with China. I think China is its biggest buyer of oil. That said, obviously, Saudi Arabia is still very much allied with the U.S. and looks to this U.S., to guarantee its security. However, all of this does suggest that Saudi Arabia is seeking to pursue a more independent path that is more about Saudi Arabia than just like being the sort of client state of the U.S. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. Saudi Arabia is very focused on asserting its sovereignty, very focused on conducting an independent foreign policy. And the Saudis will sign up for Western initiatives if and when they think those initiatives bode well for the kingdom's interest. And then they'll also sign up for Eastern Russian or Chinese-led initiatives when they think it serves their interests. They have no problem breaking with the United States when there are disagreements between Riyadh and Washington. And the renormalization with the Syrian government is a case in point. The Saudis have definitely realized that the center of geoeconomic gravity in the world has shifted away from North America and Europe toward Asia. and they've been very pragmatic in terms of responding to these changes and adjusting their foreign policy in a much more multipolar world where China has a lot more influence than it did 20 or 30 years ago when it comes to sale of energy resources, investment, commercial ties. Saudi Arabia sees itself integrating into Asia. And there's no doubt that out of all the Asian countries, China is the most important piece of the puzzle. It's really difficult for us to exaggerate the extent to which Saudi Arabia values its relationship with China. And it's symbolic, but something that kind of underscores this point is if we compare the relatively low-level reception that Joe Biden received when he went to Jeddah in July of last year versus the reception that the Chinese president received when he went there 5 months later. I think what is happening is the Saudis have come around to viewing China as a country that in many ways is much more easy to work with than the United States. Let's not be naive here and pretend that US foreign policy is guided by human rights. But there's no
Not
doubt
on this
that
show.
no one who watches this show is naive enough to believe that. But the US still invokes liberal idealism, democracy, democratic values, human rights, and is selectively willing to punish certain partners and allies the US has in the Middle East on human rights grounds. And the fact that Joe Biden took so long to directly speak to Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman after he entered the Oval Office underscores how these human rights issues do have an impact on the way the White House and the Congress look at Saudi Arabia. The Chinese do not engage in any of this. From China's perspective, issues that have to do with activists, dissidents, critical journalists being locked up in Saudi Arabia, restrictions on freedom of speech in the kingdom, those are all Saudi Arabia's domestic affairs. And the Chinese government thinks it has no business getting involved in any of that. This sort of non-interference approach to foreign policy that we see from China is very appealing to the leadership in Saudi Arabia and other countries. To get to your point about the situation in Xinjiang, it's this sort of respect for a country's sovereign rights and this policy of not commenting on human rights abuses. It goes both ways. And the Saudi leadership really appreciates how China, as well as Russia, do not interfere in these kinds of issues that Saudi Arabia sees as its domestic affairs. So to maintain that, Saudi Arabia refuses to condemn any of China's internal policies. It's pretty significant when you consider the fact that since the mid-1980s, the King of Saudi Arabia has officially been the custodian of the two holy mosques. The fact that, well, it's not only just that Saudi Arabia does not criticize the Chinese government's policies in Xinjiang, they've been very defensive of them.
Right. Yeah.
And it's really significant, and it speaks to the extent to which Saudi Arabia places so much value on its relationship with China.
No, I mean that makes so much sense. And I'm also curious, like I'm not privy to conversations among Saudi officials or even people close to them, but I'm guessing just from like logic, like the place of like logic, that if I was in any position of power in Saudi Arabia and I was looking around the last, I don't know, let's say 5 years, even just the last 5 years, and I'm seeing a few things take place. I'm seeing Afghanistan, right? The US for 20 years propped up this government in Afghanistan and then just kind of ditched it because it didn't, it ditched it in overnight almost, right? The Taliban took over and what the US was propping up collapsed. So I'm seeing that happen. I'm seeing Ukraine, right? I'm seeing Ukraine kind of used by the US as like a weapon against Russia. Ukrainians are on the front line of this war. Ukrainians are dying in this war basically for the West. And then if I was looking at my own neighborhood as Saudi Arabia, I would see like I'm the front line. Like Saudi Arabia is the front line. Like if there's a war with Iran for real, like that's who gets hit, right? And in the case of Yemen, in fact, like there was actually like Saudi oil facilities getting hit and rockets from the Houthis making their way into Saudi Arabia. So you're like a frontline country in a war that maybe you don't really want to be a part of because it would ruin your own domestic security situation. But on top of that, I would imagine that Saudi Arabia's rulers would like a future of economic prosperity and stability, and not one filled with wars where they're like engaging in war and being destabilized as a result of being like a client state of the US. That just seems like a kind of basic logic. And I'm just curious if that is some of the thinking here, is like witnessing the last few years of the US sort of behaving recklessly with its own allies.
Yeah, those are really great points you make. I think it's important to maybe go back to the start of Trump's presidency and the end of Obama's presidency. During the Obama years, the U.S. obviously negotiated and entered the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, that did not address any non-nuclear issues, and it was negotiated with no Saudi input, and that infuriated the leadership in Riyadh. Then, from the Saudi perspective, the Obama administration completely failed to understand or sympathize with Saudi Arabia's perceptions of Iran. Then when Trump's presidency began, the Saudis saw this as a really unique opportunity to sort of influence the US in ways that would bode well for Saudi Arabia's perceived interests. And Saudi Arabia was one of only 4 countries in the world that hailed Trump's decision to pull out of the JCPOA in May of 2018. And then the Saudis lobbied the US to impose maximum pressure on Iran. But we moved to 2019. There were a series of acts of sabotage in the Gulf off the UAE's coast that targeted some vessels that in September of that year were the attacks on Saudi energy infrastructure. And I think that was a really important moment for Saudi Arabia's foreign policy decision making. They realized all of the US sanctions on Iran, all the pressure on Iran, all the military threats against Iran was doing nothing to make Saudi Arabia any more secure. And I think it sort of speaks to the wisdom of Mohammed bin Salman and his ability to sort of reassess and maybe learn from some mistakes. He concluded that if we feel a threat from Iran, the best thing for us to do is talk to the Iranians. And beginning in April 2021, there were a number of rounds of talks between Saudi and Iranian officials that took place in Iraq and Oman. And that, of course, manifested in the diplomatic accord that was signed in Beijing back in March. So I think, to your point, the Saudis are definitely moving away from some of the hawkish policies that defined Riyadh's foreign policy a number of years ago when Mohammed bin Salman was sort of at the start of his ascension to power. Of course, we're talking about the war in Yemen that began in 2015, the blockade of Qatar in 2017, and then all the lobbying for maximum pressure against Iran. Right now, I think the Saudi leadership is focused on its internal development. The kingdom's economy still depends on oil. And when we get to the post-oil era, if the kingdom fails to diversify its economy, there's going to be a big crash. So I think the Saudis have their eyes wide open. They understand that the focus and the priority has to be making Vision 2030 successful. For that to happen, the Saudis have to lure a tremendous amount of foreign investment to Saudi Arabia. If there are Houthi missiles and drones coming in and hitting civilian infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, it's really difficult to convince people that it's a good idea to invest in the kingdom. So I think Mohammed bin Salman and those around him in Riyadh understand that making Vision 2030 successful requires de-escalating in the region and bringing more stability and peace to countries near Saudi Arabia, the countries that border Saudi Arabia, and trying to resolve the problems that Saudi Arabia had, with the Houthis, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, Syria, and to try to enter a new era based more on diplomacy.
Yeah, and then I guess I'd want to pivot here to, how would you describe the Saudi relationship with Russia? They haven't taken a side, right, in the war in Ukraine, despite pressure from the U.S. to do so, and also they have refused these requests from the Biden administration to produce more oil, and that request, was all about trying to lessen reliance on Russian gas around the world and keep oil prices under control. So this war could, continue without any consequences to the West. Um, so yeah, what can you talk a little bit about the Saudi relationship with Russia and how is that significant for the U.S.?
Yeah, I think if we go back to the start of the Arab Spring uprisings and the eruption of the conflict in Syria in 2011, there was a lot of tension between Saudi Arabia, which of course was in favor of uh, militias fighting the Assad government, and on the other side, Russia, which was backing the government in Damascus. And they were clearly opposing stakeholders in Syria. And obviously, there's a very long history of tension between Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union, with the conflict in Afghanistan in the 1980s being an important part of that history. However, I can't stress enough how impactful the Russian military intervention in Syria in 2015 was. The Saudis at the time did not welcome Russia's intensified military intervention that started in 2015. Of course, that was, in defense of the Syrian government that Saudi Arabia was firmly opposed to at the time. But even if they didn't like what the Russians were doing in Syria, they took away an important message. That was that Russia stands by its allies, its partners, and its friends in the Arab world. That, from Riyadh's perspective, was a huge contrast to how the US responded to the 2011 uprising in Egypt. The Saudis famously said that Obama discarded Mubarak like a used Kleenex, and it caused them to wonder, if the security of regimes in the Gulf is on the line down the road, will the U.S. stand by or not? They became very doubtful about the U.S. commitment to their security. What they saw from Russia was something very appealing. As much as they did not like Assad's government, they admired Putin's willingness to fight and to make huge sacrifices to keep an Arab ally in partner, to keep an Arab ally in power. And really, since Mohammed bin Salman began ascending to power, we've seen Saudi Arabia and Russia collaborate in many different ways. This has to do with investment, energy, security, counterterrorism. And it's important to realize that Saudi Arabia is very angry with Washington. There are so many aspects of US foreign policy that the Saudi leadership finds to be very unsettling. And this is true of other Arab countries as well. So they very much welcome a more multipolar world. And Russia is certainly a pole in this sort of emerging geopolitical order. Within this context, when the Russians waged their overt invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Saudis were not supportive of that invasion. They didn't necessarily like the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. And we've seen in UN General Assembly votes that Saudi Arabia has voted with the West to condemn Russia's invasion, occupation, and annexation of some Ukrainian land. But the Saudis don't think that anything Russia has done in Ukraine is reason to treat Russia like a pariah state or to single out Russia or cut off relations. They very much want to continue collaborating with the Russians very closely, despite everything that's happened in Ukraine. I think in general, the Saudi perspective, and we see this from officials in other Arab states, is that this conflict in Ukraine is a European conflict. It's between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO countries. They don't think Arab countries have some moral duty to, um, cut off relations with Russia and go all out in terms of supporting Ukraine. They also don't view this as a black and white conflict. While they have no problem officially condemning, and at least in terms of their UN votes, Russia's actions, they don't view this as a good versus evil conflict. In the Gulf region, many officials will talk about the eastward expansion of NATO as having been something that contributed to this. And beyond the Gulf, when you also look at public opinion in North Africa and the Levant, you see that this Western narrative about the conflict in Ukraine being good versus evil, that narrative does not have traction either on the Arab street or among Arab government officials. So, the Saudis, like the majority of Arab states, have embraced a relatively neutral position toward the conflict. They don't want to antagonize the West over this war, and they certainly don't want to antagonize Russia. They see a big future in their relationship with Russia, and they don't want to do things now that could upset the Kremlin and jeopardize future ties with Moscow.
Yeah, and then I want to move to the UAE because the UAE and Saudi Arabia do seem to typically be on the same side in much of this, in much of everything actually. Like they have quite a close alliance. Do you think there are any differences in how the Emiratis deal with the Chinese and the Russians in comparison to the Saudis? Of course, beyond the Emirates being this kind of huge conduit for money laundering, they sort of took that role away from Lebanon.
Mm.
But either way, I mean, is there any distinction between the Emiratis versus the Saudis and their relationships with China and Russia?
I think they have a lot more in common in this sense than there are any differences. The UAE too is also um, adapting to a much more multipolar world, and Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi, he's no pushover. He doesn't take orders from any foreign government, whether it's in the West or the East. The UAE is very focused on its own national interests, just as the Saudis have been. And the UAE's ability to assert its autonomy from Western countries has a lot to do with the extent to which the UAE has grown so close to Russia, China, and India. The Emiratis were, let's actually go back to the point about the intervention in Syria. The UAE was actually really the first GCC country to basically praise Russia's military intervention in Syria starting in 2015. While the UAE didn't officially renormalize relations with Damascus until late 2018, when Abu Dhabi praised Russia for fighting what Emirati and Syrian and Russian officials saw as terrorist organizations in Syria, that was kind of it was a sign of de facto support for the Syrian government. So all of this is to say the UAE is a very China-friendly and very Russia-friendly country. And in this sense, I think is very similar to how Saudi Arabia is dealing with Beijing and Moscow.
And I also imagine, I mean, the UAE at one point was participating in the war in Yemen, and then I was actually hit a few times by Houthi missiles and kind of backed off and like stopped supporting various militias there. So I imagine that played a role as well. Because I mean, what's your big like sort of attraction as the UAE, like to bring people to your country? Is we're like an island of stability in this really unstable region, an island of stability and luxury. And if you're getting hit with missiles, you can't sell that. You can't sell that image anymore. So it actually was like a huge threat to their economy to even continue to participate in that war. Uh, I'm also like curious. I want to move on to Syria for a moment because Saudi Arabia and the UAE played such a major role in reintegrating Syria. And like you mentioned, the UAE was actually like um, the UAE is actually quite close, has been close with the Assad family, even throughout the war. Like I think they're friends, but hasn't really been as antagonistic towards Syria as maybe some of the other Gulf states were. And then obviously Saudi Arabia like sort of led the way for Syria to come back into the Arab League. So how, I mean, I think this is one example of just like of one of the major outcomes of these regional shifts. Um, how significant, though, is that in regard to the power of the US, which is adamantly opposed till now to Syria, to any normalization whatsoever to Syria in the region, as long as Assad is in charge, versus the power of these other countries like China and Russia?
Yeah. So, with the exception of Oman, all of the other GCC states were supportive of groups that were fighting the Syrian government at earlier stages in the Syrian conflict. Saudi Arabia and Qatar were hands down the two biggest supporters of these groups inside the GCC, but the UAE also was in favor of regime change in Syria, and Abu Dhabi supported the Free Syrian Army, in fact. Something to keep in mind about the UAE's foreign policy is it's really defined by agility. The UAE, unlike Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, is very good at making 180-degree turns.
Mm,
And this has a lot to do with the fact that the UAE is a pretty small country. It has a lot of wealth. The UAE has a lot of stability, and the government is able to make these big changes very, very quickly without really worrying about the domestic backlash. In Saudi Arabia, it's a different story, and I would argue that that's one factor that helps us understand why Saudi Arabia moved toward reconciliation with Assad's government much more slowly than the UAE did. Um, but nonetheless, the UAE, why did they reconcile with Syria? There are many factors in play, but basically, I think the leadership in Abu Dhabi just got so frustrated with the U.S. approach to Syria. The UAE decided it was going to break with the U.S. and deal with Syria based on how the Emiratis see their national interests and not really care if the Americans have a problem with it. I think from the UAE's perspective, re-engaging with Assad was basically about coming to terms with the inevitable. Despite the UAE having supported regime change efforts earlier on in the conflict, Abu Dhabi assessed that President Assad is not going anywhere anytime soon, and his regime survived the conflict. And just giving Syria the North Korea treatment was not going to
mm,
do anything good for the Arab world. The UAE also is concerned about Iran's influence in Syria. And they
mm,
think that isolating, if Arab states and Western states isolate Syria, it gives Damascus no choice but to become closer and closer to Tehran. So the Emirati thinking is if you want to try to pull Syria away from Iran, you have to welcome Syria back into the Arab family. So that's obviously a big motivation. And the UAE also, they considering potential economic returns that can come from investing in Syria's reconstruction and redevelopment. The problem, however, has to do with the Caesar Act. This is the number one stumbling block to the UAE's ability to sort of uh, create new networks in Syria as well as build on existing networks that the UAE has in the country. As your viewers obviously know, the Caesar Act comes with secondary sanctions. So non US entities that do business with Syria, or at least do business in the parts of Syria that are under the Syrian government's control, can be targeted by the US Treasury. This so far has deterred the UAE from making huge investments in Syria. I think an interesting question we need to be asking ourselves, though, is how much longer will the UAE and some other states be deterred by the Caesar Act? I think the UAE sees the Biden administration as very weak. Also, the
mm,
Biden administration comes to the UAE for help on issues, most recently, Sudan. So the UAE understands that they have some leverage,
mm.
and the UAE might be willing to either directly, violate the sanctions and bet that the U.S. will not impose sanctions. Another factor here is the fact that, well, in my opinion, if there was ever a push to impose sanctions on the UAE, the pro Israel lobby in America would push hard against that because the
Wow.
UAE normalized relations with Israel in 2020 through the Abraham Accords. That gave the UAE a lot of maneuverability in Washington. So that fits into the
Mhm.
calculation. And then also, if the UAE is concerned about how the Treasury might, how they might have problems with the U.S. Treasury, there are other options for circumventing sanctions. The U.S. has imposed sanctions on so many countries for so many years. All of these countries have been able to learn from each other about how to circumvent sanctions. And if you look at, China's trade with Iran, the Chinese and Iranians have been very crafty about finding mechanisms for getting around sanctions. And I think countries like the UAE could use some of those tactics to trade with Syria. So I'll sort of finish this with the point that from the Syrian government's perspective, I think they probably believe that time is on their side. And it's a matter of when, not if, we get to a point when the deep pocketed Arab Gulf states start putting money into Syria one way or the other.
Yeah, that's actually gotta, from everything you just said, that's gotta cause some like DC people to just like have wires crossed. Like it's like, what do we do? Like, Joel Rayburn is probably losing sleep right now
Yeah.
over these sorts of things. Also, that we have this new act. I can't remember what the name of it. I don't have it in front of me, but this new act in Congress uh, to basically give more teeth to the Caesar sanctions. In a way where they're actually explicitly threatening to sanction these like Gulf states that the U.S. is allied with, should they rebuild in Syria. So I understand what you're saying about leverage, but then the question becomes, it's kind of like a game of chicken in a way. Like it's like once the Gulf states start because eventually they're going to test it, right? Like someone's going to test it because there's a lot of money to be made in Syria, and also having a more stable Syria means a more stable region. You don't have this refugee crisis. Nobody wants another ISIS to emerge again, and like the more instability that exists, the more like vacuums of like sort of lawlessness mixed with like extreme desperation and poverty that exists, the more likely you'll have those kinds of situations emerge. So in a way, it really does become, is Washington really willing to sanction the governments that it relies on in the region for like dollar supremacy and like for oil and all of these other things? I guess we'll have to wait and see. But do you foresee a future where the U.S. could sanction Saudi Arabia or the UAE or any of these countries that it's so close to?
It's possible, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Mm.
The Biden administration is really focused on great power competition, and the growing influence of China and Russia in the Middle East is something that very much worries the people in the Biden administration and worried the Trump administration too. And I'm sure if a Republican wins the 2024 race, Biden's successor, whoever that could possibly be, would also be concerned about China and Russia's growing clout in the Middle East. And if the US were to put sanctions on UAE or Saudi Arabia, that would definitely push those countries even closer to Beijing and Moscow. And I think that the Biden team understands that. And those dynamics concerning great power competition, I think, help us explain, why Joe Biden controversially went to Saudi Arabia in July 2022. It was a desire to um, prevent the kingdom from getting closer to Russia and China. And officials in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh understand that these dynamics are in play, and they're willing to push the envelope as much as they can.
Yeah, okay, and so then let's move on to a country that is not necessarily like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and sometimes is actually on opposite side of them, and that is Qatar. Um, so the Qataris, well, actually, I should mention also that another sort of domino effect of like the reintegration of Syria into the Arab League is also now the official Syrian opposition is like willing to negotiate with the government, which is an interesting new dynamic taking place. But also the Qataris, they weren't exactly happy to see Syria reintegrated into the Arab League, at least not publicly. Maybe privately they weren't so invested anymore. I don't know. I don't talk to these people. I imagine there was probably some domestic concern there too. They have A lot of like people inside Qatar who supported the opposition, still support the opposition, hate the Assad regime. A lot of also very rich Syrian oppositionists who are now in Qatar and hold those viewpoints too. So it was probably maybe also playing to like some domestic audience. And you feel free to elaborate or add anything you'd like to that. But I do want to, more importantly, talk about the Qatari relationship. Let's start with Russia, because I think that's the most interesting one, considering that Qatar and Russia were on completely opposing sides in Syria. I mean, Russia openly called out the Qataris for supporting Al Qaeda. Like they would just openly say the Qataris support Al Qaeda in Syria. And also, like, if you ever watched any Al Jazeera, which is like a soft power media arm of the Qataris, like when it came to this issue, it was like anti-Russia every day, all the time, whether Arabic or English. So there was clearly a lot of antagonism towards Russia. Yet, like after the handful of Gulf states, the Saudis and the Emiratis leading it, placed that blockade on the Qataris actually had no choice but to deepen ties with Russia, which was interesting. And in a way, the Iranians as well, because they actually like helped the Qataris in that situation when they were literally under blockade. I'm curious, how has the relationship between Qatar and Russia evolved, let's say, since the Arab Spring? And what has that meant for US policy in the region and beyond the region?
I would say that Qatar and Russia have mostly definitely a positive relationship right now, and they deal with each other in ways that are very pragmatic. Qatar, however, is much more in the Western orbit compared to Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Doha aligns much more closely with the West on major international issues than either the Saudis or Emiratis do. And there are ideational tensions between Qatar and Russia, and sort of the way Qatar responded to the Arab Spring uprisings compared to how Moscow did really underscores that point. So the Qataris and Russians have definitely disagreed on a lot of regional issues, but they work with each other when doing so bodes well for their national interests. The the Qataris have made huge investments in the Russian economy, and this was going on, just a few years into the Syrian crisis. So, despite disagreeing with each other over questions related to Syria, Qatar's sovereign wealth fund, QIA, Qatar Investment Authority, became one of the major Arab investors in Russia's economy. Russian tourists coming to Doha are important to Qatar's tourism sector, and the two governments engage each other. And even if they disagree on issues, they always maintain a very respectful dialogue with each other. What also led to a strengthening of the relationship was that after the blockade was imposed in 2017, Russia was very supportive of bringing that crisis to an end. Very early on in the blockade, Lavrov came to the Gulf and tried to talk to officials in the region, in the sub-region, in the GCC, about what could be done to get the blockade lifted and to move past that crisis. And Kuwait was the main mediator in that dispute, and Russia gave a lot of support to Kuwait, to Kuwaiti efforts to resolve that crisis in the GCC. To kind of a broader point that you touched upon, Qatar is this very tiny country, and it's surrounded by larger neighbors that have not always wanted to see Qatar assert its sovereignty and its autonomy. And the extent to which Qatar's foreign policy has been so independent is something that has unsettled some of its Arab neighbors. And so Qatar has, for many years, relied on a strategy of making as many friends around the world as possible. The thinking is that if there would be Saudi aggression against Qatar, there would be enough influential countries all over the world who would have stakes in Qatar remaining sovereign and independent and not just being annexed by the Saudis, which has always been the ultimate nightmare for the Qataris. And having good relations with Russia, but also with China and European countries and the US and countries in Latin America this is all important to Qatar's foreign policy. So I would not say Russia is like the most important country to Doha, but it's definitely a partner that Qatar does value, even if there are these disagreements.
And then how about, just to elaborate a bit on the China issue. And I I always like try to understand Qatar based on how they cover things on Al Jazeera, which I know isn't always exactly like 100% like this is the view of the Qatari government. However, so much of their coverage is so anti-China and anti-Russia. But I know they have a good relationship with China for the most part. It's not like completely negative. So how would you describe the relationship between the Qataris and the Chinese?
It's very much about economics and energy. There's some other ways it could evolve in terms of in investments, and also China has an important role to play in Qatar's economic diversification agenda. But again, this is mostly a relationship that has to do with energy. And even at a time in which the tensions between the US and China have heated up so much, Qatar has remained very committed to being a stable supplier of liquefied natural gas to China. China views Qatar as an incredibly important country that China wants to work with very closely. China buys a lot of LNG from Qatar, and that's extremely important to China's own economic development. Also, the Qataris and Chinese see eye to eye on some issues in the Middle East, whether we're talking about the JCPOA or the Palestinian question. So diplomatically, the two countries have some common ground. But again, I would say, though, that Qatar, unlike Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is very, very much in the Western orbit. And the kinds of ideational synergies that exist between UAE and China, UAE and Russia, those do not exist between Qatar and these Eastern powers.
Right. And then I want to move on to, and I mean, I love that we're just going Gulf state to Gulf state. You really are such like a wealth of knowledge on these issues.
Thank you.
So I appreciate you taking the time to break it all down. I want to move to the issue of Kuwait. We don't hear much about the Kuwaiti position in this new Cold War either. And you actually, I believe you have something coming out later in the year. You can mention it or not. I'm not sure if it's like, something you're not supposed to promote yet, but you actually did a deep dive into the sort of like Kuwaiti past when it comes to its relationship with the Soviet Union specifically, if I'm not mistaken, right? So can you tell us a little bit about like a brief overview about the Kuwaiti relationship with Russia, with China, and then versus the US?
Yeah, so during the Cold War, there was a lot of tension between the conservative monarchies on the Arabian Peninsula on one side and the Soviet Union and the Chinese government on the other. The monarchies in the Arabian Peninsula were very much in the Western camp in the Cold War. One exception, though, was Kuwait. As early as 1963, Kuwait established full-fledged diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. To put it into perspective, the other five Gulf Arab monarchies did not do so until the 1985 to 1990 period. So those other countries in the GCC only established relations with the Soviet Union during its final years of existence. But Kuwait saw it in its interest to sort of counterbalance its relationships with Western powers by investing in a close relationship with the Soviet Union. And it's actually very interesting. A lot of people don't know this story, but during the Iran-Iraq War, Kuwait was feeling very vulnerable, and Kuwait saw a huge threat being posed by Iranian warplanes. And so Kuwait went to the US to request the Stingers, and the US refused to provide Kuwait with them. The reason why was the US Congress was concerned that Kuwait would use those Stingers against Israel. And of course, this had to do in part because there's been a huge Palestinian population in Kuwait. But nonetheless, in response to that denial by the U.S., Kuwait went to the Soviet Union, and that resulted in Moscow giving various types of support to Kuwait to help the country feel more secure. And even after the Soviet Union imploded, that good relationship between Kuwait and Moscow carried on. And while Kuwait has been a country that, unlike Saudi Arabia and the UAE, has actually come out to really condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine beyond just votes at the UN General Assembly. Kuwaiti officials, after the invasion, spoke out, and they explained that defending Ukraine's territorial integrity is something the international community should do. And many Kuwaitis compared Russia's invasion of Ukraine to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait back in 1990. So Kuwait was very much against Russia's action in Ukraine. But at the same time, Kuwait never imposed any sanctions on Russia. Kuwait has not supported the West's efforts to squeeze Russia. And there are economic relations between Kuwait and Russia that have continued. And in March of this year, 2023, which marked the 60th year anniversary of Kuwait and Moscow formalizing relations, there was this huge ceremony with Kuwaiti officials talking about how much they value their relationship with Russia. So, like most Arab countries, Kuwait sees it in its national interests to be very close to Moscow, or relatively close to Moscow. And I think what's interesting, though, is that Kuwait's closeness to Russia, unlike the UAE's closeness to Russia, has not really created a backlash in Washington. The Kuwaitis have been able to work with the Russians in ways that are not seen as really controversial from the West's perspective. But it really speaks to the ability of the Kuwaitis to really maintain a lot of balance on the international stage.
And there's a country that you actually know quite a bit about that does not get very much attention, despite the very important role it often plays sort of behind the scenes. It's quite the humble Gulf country, and that's the country of Oman. Can you talk a bit about the significance of Oman's role in the Gulf that most people aren't really aware of?
Yeah, well, of the 6 GCC states, Oman is the one that is most geopolitically balanced. The Omanis tend to avoid taking sides in regional and international disputes, and they embrace not just neutrality, but what I would call active neutrality, where they try to use their neutrality to position Oman as a diplomatic bridge that can help different countries reconcile at times when direct dialogue between those countries isn't possible. And there are so many examples of this.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.